Welcome back to the Blood Cancers Blitz roadmap of large B-cell lymphomas. Today we will explore more of the lymphoid hemisphere in the B-cell continent. The challenge from yesterday was to consider how many large B-cell lymphomas you are aware of. How many did you find? Here's my list. Let's breathe and look for patterns. You might notice there are some that show the word rearrangements, such as there and there. Other places, you can find several that include descriptive terms, such as cutaneous, intravascular, or mediastinal. In addition, there are some that include an infectious virus, such as EBV. Based off of these observations, I've compiled 5 questions that are vital for every large B-cell lymphoma workup. First, identify location: CNS retina, mediastinum, skin/mucosa, pleural cavity, lung, intravascular, testis, and lymph node are common places within the large B-cell classifications. The locations on the left are associated with large B-cell lymphomas of those particular sites. For example, within the CNS, retina, and testis, there are primary large B-cell lymphomas of immune privileged sites. Within the mediastinum, there's primary mediastinal large B-cell lymphoma and mediastinal gray zone lymphoma. Within the skin and mucosa, the two entities mentioned here have cutaneous within the name. Further down, intravascular shows intravascular large B-cell lymphoma. There are other lymphomas that are within a lymph node or mass, but we'll come back to those later. Second question is to identify the arrangement or the architecture of the cells. There are 4 choices. The large B cells can be scattered, nodular, appear in diffuse sheets, or have no architecture or no arrangement because they're in a fluid. Based off of these arrangements of cells, you can have a differing differential diagnosis. They are scattered, consider T histiocyte-rich large B-cell lymphoma and lymphomatoid granulomatosis. If we have scattered large B cells, we should also consider ruling out nodular lymphocyte predominant Hodgkin lymphoma and classic Hodgkin lymphoma, although those two are not typically considered aggressive B-cell lymphomas. Here are some photos of the entities gathered from the online version of the WHO-5 classification. Here I circle where the large B cells are located, often with H&E sections. The membrane of the large B cells is not apparent. When considering this differential, T histiocyte-rich large B-cell lymphoma maintains all the B-cell markers. LYG often is positive for EBER. Classic Hodgkin lymphoma and nodular LP variant of Hodgkin lymphoma typically have scattered large cells within a broader macronodular architecture, as shown by these other pictures taken at lower power. The third arrangement to consider is follicular or nodular arrangement. With this arrangement, consider large B-cell lymphoma with IRF4 rearrangement and follicular large B-cell lymphoma, which was previously called follicular lymphoma grade 3B. Both of these have nodular architecture, as shown here. However, large B-cell lymphoma with IRF4 rearrangements is often positive for MUM1 and lacks BCL2 rearrangements. Third arrangement is no arrangement because the specimen is fluid. With this, consider fibrin-associated large B-cell lymphoma, fluid overload, associated large B-cell lymphoma, and primary effusion lymphoma. Morphologies of each of these will be fairly similar. However, a differential diagnosis can be determined between these by observing the infectious disease, whether they are EBV positive, HHV8 positive, or lacking positivity for both of these infections. Here are some additional photos from the WHO online classification showing fibrin-associated large B-cell lymphoma with a positive EBRIsh, fluid overload associated large B-cell lymphoma, just the H&E, and primary effusion lymphoma with an HHV8 immunohistochemical stain. Fourth arrangement, diffuse, includes a number of the location-based lymphomas that were mentioned before, and others that we will get into more detail later. The next question is to identify rearrangements. A really important rearrangement that we would consider is there MYC rearrangement. If there is MYC rearrangement only, we definitely want to consider a Burkitt lymphoma. If there is a MYC rearrangement plus BCL2 rearrangement, we consider double hit lymphoma with an asterisk that we will cover later. If there are no MYC rearrangements, we can consider whether there are 11q aberrations. And if not, there are a couple not otherwise specified categories. EBV positive large B-cell lymphoma, NOS, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, NOS, and high-grade B-cell lymphoma, NOS. These are not otherwise specified, and so it requires us to go through a number of other more specified lymphomas before we land at these essentially diagnoses of exclusion. Next question is consider infection, or EBV slash HHV8. There are several large B-cell lymphomas that are associated with EBV infection, such as EBV positive diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, as we had seen on the previous slide, EBV positive mucocutaneous ulcer, lymphomatoid granulomatosis, plasmablastic lymphoma, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma associated with chronic inflammation, fibrin-associated large B-cell lymphoma, and primary effusion lymphoma. There are also a couple that are associated with HHV8 infection, such as KSHV, HHV8, positive diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, where KSHV is just another name for HHV8, and primary effusion lymphoma, as mentioned before. Finally, consider whether there is loss of B-cell markers. This can be seen in ALK-positive large B-cell lymphoma, plasmablastic lymphoma, or HHV8 positive large B-cell lymphoma, as there is variable loss of B-cell markers. Taken together, these are the 5 questions that should be considered with every large B-cell lymphoma: location, arrangement, rearrangements, infection, and B-cell markers. Going back to our top tools chart, based off those questions, history or location of the lesion, the architecture, immunohistochemistry, and fluorescence in situ hybridization are going to be the top tools for large B-cell lymphomas. We can also notice that the 5 questions create a mnemonic device: large B, L, location, A, arrangement, R, rearrangements, E, infections, and B-cell markers. So we should consider the large B-cell questions when we have a large B cell lymphoma as part of our differential diagnosis. So how can we turn all these features into a manageable journey, from a maze to a journey? Let's start with A. Here is a chart of a differential flowchart for large B-cell lymphomas. We begin with arrangement and then proceed to location and look at rearrangements and B-cell markers. We'll go through each section in more detail. First of all, if you see large cells present, consider the arrangement of the cells. If they're scattered, consider the four entities we mentioned at the beginning. T histiocyte-rich large B-cell lymphoma, lymphomatoid granulomatosis, nodular LP Hodgkin lymphoma, and classic lymphoma. If it's nodular, consider follicular large B-cell lymphoma and large B-cell lymphoma with ERF4 rearrangement. If it's in fluid, consider fibrin-associated large B-cell lymphoma, fluid overload-associated large B-cell lymphoma, and primary effusion lymphoma. If it's in sheets, we go to the next section. This next section, we consider the location. Is it in the CNS, retina, testis, or other immune privileged site? Is it in the mediastinum? Is it in the skin or mucosa? Is it in the pleural cavity? Is it in the lung? Is it intravascular? With these two questions of arrangement and location, we can effectively rule out 14 of the 23 large B-cell lymphomas. If it's in a node or mass, we go to the next section. Here, we consider whether there are retained B-cell markers and rearrangements. If there are retained B-cell markers, we look for MYC rearrangement to consider Burkitt or double hit lymphoma, and BCL2 rearrangements. If there's no MYC rearrangement, then if the morphology prompted us to consider Burkitt anyway, consider large B-cell lymphoma with 11q aberrations. Otherwise, we're left with no other specific ways of classifying the large B-cell lymphoma except EBV positive large B-cell lymphoma, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma NOS, or high-grade B-cell lymphoma NOS. High-grade B-cell lymphoma NOS is a rare and heterogeneous diagnosis and should not be considered frequently. If we do arrive at diffuse large B-cell lymphoma NOS, then the Hans algorithm of considering GC subtype and non-GC subtype are useful because those become additional ways to further specify an unspecified diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. The Hans algorithm includes staining and interpretation of CD10, BCL6, and MOM1. If B-cell markers are lost, consider ALK-positive large B-cell lymphoma, plasmablastic lymphoma, and HHV8 positive lymphoma, with additional markers such as ALK, EBV, and HHV8. With this algorithm, we're able to systematically and concisely consider all of the large B-cell lymphomas within the WHO system. One additional note, we should consider the history. There is a previous low-grade B-cell lymphoma or leukemia. Those can transform into a higher grade morphology and large B-cell lymphoma morphology. Can also consider if it is a CLL with withholding BTK inhibitor treatment. Those can also show large B-cell morphology. That can be a temporary response to withholding treatment. Should also consider immunosuppressant medications or any other inborn immune errors or mutations, and those should be included in a comment. Now, what about the WHO versus ICC? There are some major differences. Within the WHO5 classification, double hit lymphomas only include MYC and BCL2 rearrangements. The second category includes DLBCL NOS. However, within the ICC's classification system, double hit lymphomas can include MYC and BCL2 rearrangements or MYC and BCL6 rearrangements. And then the third category is DLBCL NOS. So if you happen to find MYC and BCL6 rearrangements, it would be a separate entity within the ICC classification. However, within the WHO5 classification, those would go into the DLBCL NOS category. A minor difference could be considered the differences between large B-cell lymphoma of immune privileged sites within the WHO5 system and large B-cell lymphoma of the testis and large B-cell lymphoma of the CNS, as described in the ICC system. Basically, the ICC separates out these two immune privileged sites. So it calls the CNS disease separate from testis disease. There are also some differences that I consider inconsequential between the WHO5 and the ICC, where the diagnosis is more or less the same, however, the name is just somewhat different, such as fluid overload associated large B-cell lymphoma in the WHO5 is called HHV8 negative, EBV negative, primary fusion-based lymphoma. The name in the ICC is simply more descriptive than the WHO5 name. Or high-grade lymphoma with 11q aberrations in the WHO5 is called a large B-cell lymphoma with 11q aberrations in the ICC system. And the WHO5 NLP Hodgkin lymphoma is the term that is retained, whereas in ICC, the same disease is called NLP B-cell lymphoma. Those in mind, let's consider some cases. Here we have a 60-year-old female with a GI mass. Here it is at low power. At higher power, we see diffuse sheets of large cells. By IHC, they're negative for AE13, so we ruled out carcinoma. They're positive for CD20, PAX5, and CD19, all B cell markers. CD3 shows rare background T cells. Eber-ish is negative. Cytogenetics and FISH studies show the presence of a MYC rearrangement and a BCL2 rearrangement, but no BCL6 rearrangement. Using our large B cell, our large B questions, location, colon, it's nonspecific, arrangement of cells, diffuse, rearrangements are present, MYC and BCL2 rearrangements, infection, it's no EBV, B cell markers, it retains B cell markers CD20 and CD19. Using this flowchart, large cells are present. It appears in sheets. The colon is not on our list of specific sites here. It retains B cell markers. There's a MYC rearrangement and a MYC and a BCL2 rearrangement. Thus, we land at a final diagnosis of double hit lymphoma or high-grade B-cell lymphoma with MYC and BCL2 rearrangement. What about the Hans algorithm, you may ask? This is primarily important for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma NOS, because that is a way to further specify a unspecified lymphoma. However, double hit lymphomas are typically germinal center phenotype, but this is not something we see in 100% of the cases. Nevertheless, in this case, additional stains were done, and it is positive for CD10, BCL6, and MUM1, and thus it retains a germinal center phenotype in this case. Case 2, 70-year-old male with a liver mass. We have a core biopsy with sheets of large cells, negative for keratin, positive for CD45, and so it comes to the Hemepath service. It's positive for CD20 and PAX5, our B cell markers. CD3 shows rare background T cells, and it's also negative for EBER. By cytogenetics and fish studies, there is a BCL6 rearrangement that is present, but no MYC or BCL2 rearrangements. Using our large B question format, location is liver, the arrangement of cells is diffuse, rearrangements, no MYC rearrangement, no EBV infection, and it retains B cell markers. We go through the flow chart again. Large cells are present, diffuse arrangement, liver is not on our list of specific locations, retains B cell markers, no MYC rearrangement, and it's negative for EBV. And so we're left with diffuse large B cell lymphoma NOS. In this case, the Hans algorithm will be important. Additional stains were done. It is negative for CD10, positive for BCL6, and positive for MUM1, which leads us to a final diagnosis of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma NOS with non-GC subtype. Case 3. Here an 80-year-old male with a mass. Here it is at low power. And at higher power, or moderate power. And here it is at higher power. Sheets of large cells. The location of this lesion has not been specified yet. CD45 shows as lymphoid or hematopoietic. CD20 and PAX5 are retained, consistent with B cells. CD3 shows rare scattered T cells, is also negative for EBER. No rearrangements were detected by fish. Now for our features. Using our large B framework, we notice that we have not identified location. And so we go back and find the location. In this case, it is testis. Arrangement, diffuse. Rearrangements, no diagnostic rearrangements present. Infection, no EBV. And it retains B cell markers. Again, going to our algorithm, there are sheets of large cells. And as we look for locations, testis is on our list of specific locations. So we would, our primary differential or working diagnosis would be primary large B-cell lymphoma of immune privileged sites. Next, 60-year-old male with a lung lesion. Here it is at lower power. And here it is at higher power. We see sheets of large cells within a vessel. Here's CD45. CD20 and PAX5 highlights the large B cells. CD3 shows very rare background T cells. It's also negative for EBER. There wasn't enough tissue to perform FISH in this specimen. And so we go through our large B questions. Location, intravascular. Arrangement, diffuse. Rearrangements, we're not able to detect at this time. Infection, no EBV, and it retains B cell markers. Back to the flow chart. We have sheets of large cells, and if we look at the locations, we notice intravascular. So our working diagnosis is going to be intravascular large B-cell lymphoma. Our final case is a 30-year-old male with a back and epidural tumor. Here it is at low power. And at higher power, we can see sheets of large cells. CD45 is positive, but with dim staining. It's negative for CD20 and for CD3. However, we do see staining of PAX5, and it's negative for EBER. Other B cell markers include CD79A, which is negative. CD138 shows partial positivity. CD30 is negative, and ALK1 is positive. Because of the inconsistent expression of B cell markers, additional studies were done to prove the clonality, and a monoclonal IgH was discovered. Going to our large B questions. Location. This is epidural. It wasn't considered exactly within the CNS because it was seeping out of it. It wasn't considered exactly within the CNS, but it was near the CNS. Arrangement, diffuse. Rearrangements, not tested in this case. Infection, no EBV. B cell markers, it's great loss of B cell markers. So we see it's negative for CD79A, CD20, and diminished expression of CD45. Going back to our algorithm, there are sheets of cells. This wasn't exactly inside the CNS, and so we're not going to consider it a CNS lymphoma or primary immune privileged sites lymphoma. It had loss of B cell markers, and we saw it was positive for ALK1. So our working diagnosis in this case is ALK positive large B cell lymphoma. Congratulations! We made it to the end of this part of the journey. We learned the landscape, considering the differences between myeloid and lymphoid, leukemia and lymphoma, acute versus chronic. We learned the 10 tools and described them by analysis target and analysis type. And then we began to make mental maps covering acute myeloid leukemias and creating a mental map through the 38 entities within that category, throughout the 15 entities of acute lymphoblastic leukemias, and through 23 large B cell lymphoma entities. Oops. What a journey it has been. We can continue the process of looking at the diagnoses, noticing patterns, and creating mental maps for other groups of entities that were not covered here, such as low-grade B-cell lymphomas, T-cell lymphomas, plasma cell neoplasms, myelodysplastic neoplasms, myeloproliferative neoplasms, and MDS MPNs. Consider how many of them are you aware of? Consider how to group them into different categories. How could you organize them? Store your responses in a notebook, digital file, or log. After you complete these mental maps, go back and you can continue to add upon your foundation by exploring entities in more detail. Thank you for joining and coming to the end of the Blood Cancers Blitz.